Welcome back, everyone. No, this is not another $21 paddle video. I'm in the process of packing this up to return it, but there were a couple of comments that brought up a topic that I wanted to cover. I will not be keeping this and using it as a spare / backup paddle. Not ever would I use this as a backup paddle. Let's talk about why. Let's go. Okay, welcome back, everyone. It's good to see you all. So why won't I use this as a backup paddle? And there's a number of reasons, and this is a Brett thing. I don't think that this is the way other people think about backup or spare paddles. And when I'm talking about backup or spare paddles, I'm talking about the paddle on the back of my boat. A lot of people put them on the front of the boat. I put them on the back of the boat. A paddle on the back of the boat in case my primary paddle gets lost or broken, right? Like I wouldn't keep this to hand off, oh, you need a paddle here, use this. I wouldn't do that. I would use one of those for that. And so these are sort of Brett's rules for backup paddles. I don't know what other people do. Watch the video and then tell me down below how you deal with backup paddles. But the first reason that I'm not going to use this as a backup paddle, I don't trust it. Like it performed amazingly well for a $21 paddle, but I do not have a lot of faith that with regular use or with regular exposure to the elements that this paddle is going to hold up. I would not have been surprised if one of the blades fell off. That's reason number one, is that I don't trust it. I will add, so I was having a conversation with my friend Johnny this morning, and he said, man, I was looking in the video with the $21 paddle and I never could really see the back deck well enough to know if there was a paddle back there. And I said, oh yes, there was absolutely a Werner. I believe I had a Werner on the back deck. There was absolutely a spare paddle just in case, because I was not confident that that was gonna survive. Brings me to, what do I use as my backup paddle? And I have a system. I tend to forget things. And so I have learned over the years that I need to have systems. So I have a process for choosing my spare or backup paddle. And before I tell you that process, which is pretty straightforward, I want you to understand what I think is going to be the reason that I'm going to go to a backup paddle. And the reason that I go to a backup paddle is I'm in bad conditions and a paddle either breaks or it gets lost. So think about like a surf landing, which I don't really like doing. If I did one, there's a good chance that I could break or lose a paddle. Really bad weather and rough water, there I'm more likely to lose a paddle than break a paddle. In general, to break a high quality paddle, it needs to come into contact with something that is like a rock, a beach, something like that. Those are the occasions. I have paddled in wind that was so strong that I was concerned the paddle was going to get blown out of my hand. That is a possibility. It's not often, but that is a possibility. Which brings up the question, well then, Brett, you should use a paddle leash. I don't like paddle leashes. I know an instructor that got tangled in a paddle leash in surf and it got wrapped around his neck. I don't do paddle leashes. If you do a paddle leash, great, but be aware they're a choking hazard. Yeah, or a hazard in terms of entanglement. So I don't use paddle leashes. So those are my concerns. I'm in bad weather. I'm in really rough conditions. I break or lose a paddle. A lot of people use cheaper, smaller, lighter paddles as their spare backup. I'm using spare backup interchangeably, so I'm saying them both. And in those conditions, if I were to break or lose a paddle, I don't want to go to a paddle that is remarkably different than my primary paddle. So on the wall behind me, I have the Lendal bent shaft, the Lendal modified crankshaft, that's what they call it, which is on the wall because I don't really use it. And it's a beautiful paddle and it looks great on the wall. Next to that is my older Werner Kamano. That was my backup paddle for my new Werner Kamano, and I think that's the way you should do it. If for whatever reason you're like, it's time for me to upgrade paddles, it's time for me to replace this paddle with something newer, I think that you should use a paddle that is very similar to your primary paddle, so that if you are in bad conditions or rough weather or rough sea state, and you lose a paddle, you're not switching to a paddle that is remarkably different. That is not a time or an environment to be making a change like that. I think it's a great idea to have your spare paddle be your slightly older paddle. Before I did this sort of round of upgrades, my previous paddle was the Werner Calliste, which I liked but didn't love. I used it on the inside passage before I got this Kamano. And if you're from the Pacific Northwest, forgive me, I think it's actually pronounced Kamano. Again, in the comments, let me know. I'm pretty sure it's pronounced Kamano. I think it's an island. Is it an island? Tell me. In any case, when that was my primary paddle, the Calliste was my backup. A little different blade shape, so I didn't love it as a backup, but I didn't want to get rid of the paddle, so it was a good option. Then when it was time for me to move away from this to another one, I got just another Kamano, and then I had identical but slightly older as my backup. So that's how I run backups. I don't think you should be changing your paddle when the poo is hitting the proverbial fan. I think that that's an important thing. Again, that's a thing that I came up with. That's a thing that I believe. If you've been taught differently, if you've heard differently, I don't know what ACA teaches. I don't know what other instructors do, but that's what I do. And I have a chain of paddles, so it's easy for me to do that, and maybe not everyone can do that. Hey, Brett from the future, one thing I want to add to that. Currently, the older Kamano that's on the wall is not my backup. Currently, the Lendal Voyager and my Werner Kamano I alternate. So if I do a big trip, I've got a big trip coming up in a couple weeks, I'll bring those two paddles and alternate them. It's spreading the wear. They feel very similar to me in the water. Blade shape is pretty similar, so I don't mind switching off like that. So currently I'm not using two Kamanos. I'm using the Lendal Voyager and the Werner Kamano. And I love them both, which is why I'm doing that. And I'm equally comfortable with both. Okay, back to me. We're gonna pack this up. I would not use this as a backup because I don't trust it. It's going in the box, and we'll send it back to Amazon. Yeah. So that ends our paddle diatribe, and we won't see the $21 paddle anymore. So there you go. That's how I handle backups. How do you handle backups? Let me know down below. I think I've said that too many times now. I'll see you on the water. Oh, there.